Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it a moment so people can come into the webinar, and we'll get started shortly. All right, it is 1 past the hour, so let's get started. Hello, my name is Sarah Lewis, and on behalf of the Balanced Supply of Housing, I am pleased to welcome you to today's Research in Progress webinar, Building Momentum, Overcoming Systemic Barriers to Nonprofit Housing in Montreal. We'll take a deeper dive into how nonprofit housing providers in the city are navigating finding promising solutions to create more affordable housing. Before we begin, a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. We are hosting today's webinar from the stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in so-called Vancouver. Indigenous people are proportionally impacted by housing inequality as a direct result of colonial violence, and we encourage you to consider where you live, work, and play, and how the land stewarded by Indigenous peoples longer than written history plays a role in your life. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. We'll dedicate time at the end of the webinar for discussion with our panelists. You can also use the Q&A section if you have any technical issues, and we'll reach out directly to support you. To read along, you can enable live captioning by clicking the CC option below. You also have the option to translate captions into another language of your choice. With that, let me introduce our speakers today. Alina McKay is a housing researcher at the Balanced Supply of Housing and the Housing Research Collaborative at UBC's Peter Allard School of Law. She completed her master's in sociology and PhD in population and public health at the University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on the links between housing, security, and well-being. Adam Mongrain is housing policy director at Vivre, a nonprofit advocating for sustainable land use. His team researches housing affordability, the gap between median prices and incomes, and ways to improve neighborhoods without driving up costs. Their report, Portes Ouvertes, outlines 16 solutions to the housing crisis. Vivre also runs a pilot for public and rental registries in Quebec and Ontario. Adam also contributed to the blueprint for more and better housing as part of the Housing and Climate Task Force. Ines Zerrouki is a housing policy advisor at Vivre, where she conducts research and develops content on housing policy and market dynamics. With a background in urban planning, communications, and real estate development, she is committed to advancing sustainable, inclusive, and evidence-based housing policies that shape resilient communities. And finally, Nik Luka is based at McGill University, where he is cross-appointed to both the architecture and urban planning professional schools. He's also the Associate Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal. His research and professional practice focus on the reproduction of everyday space, including policy-led remaking of cities and suburbs. He has collaborated closely with civil society organizations and state agencies on community-based design for almost 25 years. His currently funded projects cover topics such as densification in post-war landscapes, walkability, deep energy retrofit processes, and a Montreal-focused project on commoning in the Champ des Possibles. With that, let's turn to Alina for a brief introduction to BSH and today's webinar.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm very pleased to introduce this webinar, which will focus on Vivre's important work identifying and overcoming barriers to nonprofit housing in the Montreal metropolitan area. This research was funded by Balanced Supply of Housing, which is a SSHRC CMHC-funded partnership grant led by Professor Alexandra Flynn at UBC's Allard School of Law. The project is part of the Balanced Supply of Housing's research on reshaping the financialization of housing. Research in this area explores the role of financialization and government funding in shaping housing supply and identifies barriers and opportunities to creating the right supply that meets the needs of households that are in housing stress or may be forced to move due to a lack of affordable housing in their chosen community. Historically, Montreal has had a large supply of affordable rental housing compared to other metropolitan areas in Canada. However, in recent years, Montreal has also experienced low vacancy rates and upward pressures on rents, with the average vacant two-bedroom unit renting for 53.5% more than occupied units in 2024. Nonprofit units can provide affordability in perpetuity, and therefore building new nonprofit housing is important to protecting affordability. However, just over 7% of Montreal's dwellings are social and community housing. This led Vivre and Ville to ask, what are the barriers to nonprofit housing and how can they be removed? This research involves a literature review, 2 focus groups, and policy scan. Findings have contributed to Vivre and Ville's second edition of Vivre, an ambitious guide to policy in Canada that can help unlock affordable housing supply. Vivre is currently available in French, and the English version will be released in the coming weeks, so don't forget to sign up for the BSH and Vivre and Ville's newsletters. You can also find more information about the study on the BSH website and listen to our past and upcoming podcasts to hear Adam and Ines speak more about the project. With that, I'll turn it over to Adam and Ines.
Thank you, Alina. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here, and I am delighted to share the ins and outs of our research project, Overcoming Institutional Obstacles to Nonprofit Housing Production in Montreal. I want to start with a word about Vivre en Ville, for which Ines and I work. We are an advocacy nonprofit founded in '96, pleading with governments, local and national, for sustainable land use and governance policies. Our team is about 55 strong, and about half of us are technical specialists. So we plead with electeds for better outcomes, and when they need help to design and implement policies, we sell expert services to them. We got into the housing space because our mission to create a sustainable and livable environment is threatened by all forms of housing crises. And we can't say that we are creating the kind of world that we want to live in if the price of entry is beyond the means of everyone living here. On the matter of living here, Vivre en Ville acknowledges the ancestral presence of the Yanyen-Kehaga communities of Ganawake and Kanesatake, who have historically occupied the territory now known as Greater Montreal. It also wishes to highlight that this territory has, over time, welcomed many Indigenous nations who settled here at various moments throughout history. To this day, a diverse Indigenous population, including members of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, reside on this land in a variety of socioeconomic conditions. This territory has long served as a site of gathering and exchange for First Peoples and is historically where the Great Peace of Montreal was signed by 39 First Nations in 1701. It is in a spirit of peace, justice, and reconciliation, and by drawing inspiration from Indigenous knowledge, that Vivre en Ville works towards the well-being of communities and the protection of the Greater Montreal territory today and for generations to come. With that being said, here's a quick overview of today's presentation. I am going to speak first about the context and framing of our study, and then I will hand it over to Ines to go over our methods, our results, and some news and progress about what has been going on in the nonprofit sector in Montreal since we launched this study in 2021. Let's start with a bigger picture statement. For Vivre en Ville, nonprofit housing is not an end in itself. And the aim of our work is not just to prop up nonprofit housing. In line with our mission statement, we believe that everyone is entitled to residential dignity and liberty. And that means that all symptoms and all causes of the housing crisis are things that we need to seek out and eliminate. Nonprofit housing, in our view, is one of the ways that we tip back the scales to undo decades of, let's say, bad housing policies. And we have to do everything at once, not just that, including, of course, rent controls in the private market, construction and zoning code reform, to make sure that no one is left behind. What does that mean in practice, to leave no one behind? Well, our actual goal is to see rent inflation fall behind consumer price index inflation, meaning that housing services stop being a driver of inflation for everyday people. The effects are more diffused and immediate, so this does not hold at all scales. But broadly speaking, this would mean that the price of housing generally is falling behind growth in all available income tranches for all households in the aggregate. Looking at historical data from CMHC and StatCan for Quebec, we see that these conditions need an extremely high vacancy rate, around 6 or 7%, which you can see with the orange line in the graph. This is when the consumer price index, so the gray line, falls below the average rent inflation, so the green bands. So it's simple, right? We just need to get the vacancy rate up to 7%, so let's do it. But it doesn't tend to happen by itself, and whenever it does, it doesn't stick. Part of the problem is that new construction by private market actors rely on buyers with the means to pay for the cost of new construction, which makes sense. When new construction prices increase, like they have in the past 20 years, the sticker price does not immediately mean more construction activity from builders who want to profit from high prices. There's a simple reason. There simply aren't millions and millions of people ready and willing to pay for the new homes at their current price. So when there aren't that many buyers in the buyer pool, the market reacts by anticipating a slower absorption rate and then slowing down or canceling new construction so that they don't keep excess inventory. This is what's happening with the condo market in the Greater Toronto area, for example. This is what we call the home price increase doom loop. And in our reading, it's one of the most important problems to get stable and high vacancy rates. So if the market will not absorb pricey units, why not just deliver units at a lower price? Everyone loves affordable housing. And if you have cheap homes, well, your buyer pool is larger just because it's within the means of more households. It's really a great idea, but it's also very hard in practice. The reason is that with the current construction cost, if you cap operating revenue with either discounted rent or sale price, you need a huge amount of subsidy to cover for the development and operating costs. To be clear, this is still something we should and must do, but with this scheme here, there simply isn't enough money to deliver units at scale and get us to a 7% vacancy rate. So our framing solution is not to use the term affordable housing, but instead nonprofit housing. Nonprofit simply means that anything that gets built without accounting for profit seeking at the moment of construction or rent seeking by the operator after construction. And since the precise aim of this framing is to include market effects or induce market effects through high vacancy rates, we choose not to use the term non-market housing either. Now, for the sake of clarity, while we say nonprofit housing, in our experience with housing providers in Quebec, nonprofit always means subsidized in one way or another. Every project we've studied also has some sort of subsidy to bring down costs for the builder or consumers. But we think that using the word nonprofit going forward opens more doors than it closes. And we will need to open those doors because we have a lot of ground to make up. As Alina said, as it stands in Quebec, the nonprofit housing only accounts for about 7% of the total housing supply, which is, of course, way too little to significantly affect market outcomes. And this is a province where the government has continually financed the production of nonprofit housing, even after the end of federal funding in the 90s, which is mostly the orange bands that you see on the graph. Here we see that the production brought online by different funding streams. The important parts for your information is that after 95, the province played a significant role in financing and facilitating the construction of nonprofits. So you see that there's a huge dip in the middle. So that's when federal funding stopped. And after that, provincial programs took over. But even with that participation, the production is lower now than it was in the 70s and 80s. And now it needs to serve the needs of a much larger population. Which brings us to our research project. Taking into account how nonprofit organizations are a key component of our way out of our different housing crises, we decided to look into the ways to identify and overcome institutional and systemic barriers so that we can flood the market with nonprofit units of all kinds. Our goals with this research were to identify the barriers by talking with practitioners, document them in a way that is legible to researchers and electeds, develop tools and reference materials to show that these barriers can be overcome, and create spaces and opportunities for knowledge sharing and training to help all sector partners learn from each other's experiences. And with that, I am handing over the mic to my colleague Ines to discuss our methods and findings.
Hi, I just need a second. I don't seem to be able to open my camera. I can't open my okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Adam. So based on the previous work led by Vivre in the previous years, we've developed an approach based on 5 components. So first and foremost, we've reviewed past literature on the various barriers to nonprofit housing, as well as reviewed the different policy approaches in the Montreal region. Having gathered quite the list of examples from other cities around the world, we were able to analyze various cases and understand how these different policies shape the nonprofit housing sector. We also had the opportunity to meet with various nonprofit housing developers through workshops to pinpoint the particular obstacles they face and brainstorm together on how to move past them. Finally, we are producing a set of recommendations for the public actors on how to reduce and eliminate barriers to nonprofit construction. So as previously mentioned, this research project study area is the Greater Montreal, as shown on this map. We have selected this area as it is the territory of the Communauté Métropolitaine de Montréal, so CMM, that is the Metropolitan Community of Montreal. It is a legal entity that unites together 82 municipalities in order to ensure regional integration of land use planning, economic development, environmental protection, public transport, and housing. The CMM allocates between 30 and 50% of its annual budget to the Metropolitan Social Housing Fund. This fund is unique in Canada. It reimburses municipalities for their contribution to social housing, ensuring equitable distribution of funding across the region. Going on to the results of the research now, we've separated the different barriers to development of nonprofit housing into 3 different categories. Jumping directly into the financial obstacles, we've noticed a decrease in the allocated sums in the various governmental funding programs, as shown in a previous graph by Adam. Nonprofit housing programs are also de facto considered riskier investments when compared to for-profit projects, seeming altogether less credible. Even private lenders will consider subsidized housing projects to be riskier than conventional projects and will generally impose more difficult lending conditions. There has also been a significant increase in construction and land costs due to various changes in the labor market and the demand for housing. As for the capacity, we have noticed that teams with nonprofit organizations have various levels of technical, administrative, and development abilities. There is a high level of staff turnover and recruitment of workers, meaning a lack of organizational memory and less agility. There is an aging housing stock for both the buildings held in nonprofit portfolios, but also in public portfolios. While the aging public buildings aren't necessarily related to nonprofit organizations, it does become an issue when nonprofit organizations choose to acquire such buildings. Finally, for the policy changes, we've noticed that many nonprofit developers mentioned that the policy framework is limiting density, making economies of scale less likely for them. Also, current policies enable many not in my backyard groups, making development more difficult and lengthy. And additionally, the approval process for the development of housing has been qualified as lengthy and complex to navigate. It currently doesn't discriminate between the nature of profit made before or non-profits. Now going on to the solutions, here are some of the most promising solutions that my team and I came across. With no surprise, we must reduce the development costs for nonprofit housing projects that can be facilitated by an accelerated approvals process and granting exceptions from some fees and charges that are expected for all real estate developers. Additionally, we must facilitate the access to quality, affordable land. So this may be done by transferring public land either free of charge or below market rate to nonprofit developers, or possibly by opting for long-term leases to reduce the cost of nonprofit residential development projects. For example, the nonprofit developers could build housing onto a public land and would be able to manage it free of charge for, let's say, 99 years. And before the land in the nonprofit building would be transferred back to the public entity. We must also overhaul our policy frameworks to directly benefit the nonprofit housing. So this may be done to encourage nonprofit residential projects. And at this stage, we've noted two interesting strategies, that is incentive zoning and differentiated zoning. By incentive zoning, we mean a zoning strategy that would encourage private developers to carry out turnkey nonprofit housing projects. This would encourage landowners to sell their land to nonprofit developers and in turn encourage nonprofit housing. In parallel, by differentiated zoning, we mean a strategy that creates a predictable project delivery environment for nonprofit developers and municipality through an alternative standards program that enables project to proceed as of right. So you may be more familiar with this idea as the affordable housing overlay as first adopted in Cambridge, Massachusetts. These two strategies would only increase density for nonprofit housing projects, giving these projects a competitive advantage and allowing them to stand tall next to for-profit conventional projects. It is important to note also that when my colleague Leila Ghaffari, now associate professor at Concordia University, started this project back in 2020, we did not expect the progress that we have witnessed in housing policy in Montreal ever since. In the last 5 years that elapsed, we've seen, however, 5 significant sectoral and policy changes. That is notably the creation of an alliance of nonprofit developers, the creation of the CMHC's Housing Supply Challenge, and the readiness of Montreal-based organizations to participate, the creation of a temporary housing superpower at the provincial level in Quebec, the adoption of various policies on the transfer of public buildings and lands for nonprofit housing purposes, and the adoption of a differentiated zoning policy in a Montreal borough. So let's take a moment to appreciate each of these. So while the Alliance des Corporations d'Habitation Abordable du Québec, that is ACHA, was founded in 2017, its presence in the housing sector didn't really start until 2021. So that is at the same time as our research project. Its aim is quite simple: uniting the various nonprofit housing organizations under a single voice to better advocate for their interest and develop and offer professionalization services. We're happy to note that they've been successful in uniting a majority of the sector with over 25 partners across Quebec. In the coming years, it will be interesting to see how their advocacy work shapes the landscape of nonprofit housing here in Montreal and Quebec, but also how it can inspire others across the country. Then we have the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, that launched the Housing Supply Challenge in 2021, targeting housing experts and professionals. The challenge aimed to remove and reduce barriers that hinder housing supply. Across its 5 rounds, Montreal-based organizations have been able to showcase their expertise, benefit from significant funding, create incredible relationships with other organizations, and innovate in their fields. While many of the projects funded by the challenge are still in development, we can already reap some of the benefits. On this, I will let my colleague Nik elaborate a little later. Then in 2023, the Quebec government also introduced many changes to the housing sector with its Law 31, modifying various laws in housing, including the creation of a temporary housing superpower. Until 2027, municipalities with over 10,000 inhabitants and a vacancy rate of less than 3% have the authority to authorize housing projects consisting primarily of social, affordable, and student housing. So basically, that is non-profit housing. As of now, the superpower has been used 11 times in the Montreal area, with approximately half of the targeted projects in the peripheries. However, while the superpower does indeed enable the growth of nonprofit residential development, it does remain dangerous because it doesn't directly address the obstacles to the development and instead addresses projects piece by piece. It is necessary to focus on updating urban planning plans and regulations, as well as the work processes of municipal employees. Additionally, we're noting the creation of various initiatives to facilitate the transfer of municipal buildings and lands for nonprofit purposes. The City of Montreal, as well as the governments of both Canada and Quebec, all unveiled new policies with interactive maps showcasing potential sites for future nonprofit projects. I will personally be quite excited to see what comes of such initiatives, and I'm rather hopeful that other municipalities in the Communauté Métropolitaine de Montréal will adopt such practices. Finally, I should mention the differentiated zoning policy adopted just 2 weeks ago by the Borough of Ville in Montreal. As mentioned, it is a framework based on the affordable housing overlay of Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it is also the first of its kind in Quebec. So this marks definitely a turning point in housing policy in Quebec. Surely Ville is leading by example, and it will necessarily inspire other boroughs and municipalities to follow suit. On this note, I'll let my colleague Nik complete.
Thank you so much, Ines, and thank you, Adam. Thank you, Alina and Sarah, for hosting, and of course to the BSH ecosystem. It's really a delight as the faculty, core faculty partner on this initiative to share a few examples of other complementary projects that are being done with other community-based organizations in the Montreal metropolitan region. And I'm starting here with some work that was done quite early on, about 5 years ago, in the early days of the Balanced Supply of Housing partnership. This, if we could just back up to that previous slide, the work that was done was with Village Urbain, which is a nonprofit startup in a sense, which was formed to create co-housing demonstration projects in Montreal. And a couple of our team members did some detailed work examining how we can scale up approaches to participatory co-housing for Montreal within the Quebec legal, cultural, and institutional context. So this is just an example of a report that's forthcoming on that, international examples, but also Quebec-based examples on how we can actually provide bricks and mortar evidence, so to speak, of the really important nonprofit housing opportunities that exist, which have existed and are abundant in our landscapes, but which really deserve to be scaled up. So on the next slide, if we move along here, what we see is some examples of the project that it was initially undertaken by Village Urbain, and it is actually a co-housing initiative, which is under construction at this moment in the eastern borough of Lachine, in which a number of dwellings are clustered around shared amenities and courtyards, and this is nonprofit decommodified housing. So it's a demonstration project that is proof of concept, obviously, under the contemporary sort of institutional and legal and financial constraints and opportunities framework that we're working in, but it's also been a very important sort of demonstration initiative that enables us to recognize other sorts of operational, procedural implementation barriers and bridges. Now, it's all fine and dandy to have an example that is being enjoyed by a certain number of households, and it can be shown in photographs and so on and so forth. But one of the great important pathways for the work that we're doing with Vivre en Ville on really trying to identify and work through the barriers to nonprofit housing is to make it more accessible and visible so that diverse publics really can have access and ask questions about it. So on the following slide, I just want to show you, this is an example of this is an image of the project that's under construction. And if we carry on, what we see on the next slide is we're actually now scaling up to a much larger project. Village Urbain has also partnered with a number of other organizations, including a nonprofit housing developer called Échelle Abordable, which means literally ladder, affordable ladder, affordable scale, depending on your translation. And the project is called Village Vert. It's in Laval, which is the second largest island in the Montreal archipelago, and is well known to some people and to many all Montrealers as an important frontier of suburban space in the metropolitan region. And this is a very exciting project in scaling up, because it's not just that we're going to see a really important mix of housing, rental and owner-occupied that is nonprofit, but also community space and important sorts of institutional spaces, notably for the Conseil régional de l'environnement de Laval. And if we go on to the next slide, the exciting part of this is that we're actually opening in a few weeks what's called a pavillon, a demonstration exhibition space for intergenerational co-housing, which is going to be a sort of a crowdsourcing a hive or hub, where we're going to spend the next year actually talking to Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde, they sort of Mr. and Mrs. Everybody in the metropolitan region, through fun activities and events, but also showing them a bricks and mortar one-to-one prototype of what this kind of nonprofit housing can look like in a sort of an alternative format. On the following slide, what I've got here is just another image of this exciting pavilion. It's quite literally a temporary installation that will be on the site. And the site, going back to one of the key points that was made by Ines, is the importance of providing high quality land at reasonable cost or at no cost. And in the case of the Village Vert project that I'm showing here, what's really exciting about this project is that the municipality has actually provided land that it owns at a very, very attractive under very attractive terms. And of course, many people in the nonprofit housing sector know that the cost of land is one of the most problematic factors in contributing to affordability challenges and questions. Finally, just to wrap up, we're also making some advances on the policy front, and as was really stressed by Ines on the importance of overhauling policies to benefit nonprofit housing, we need to revise the regulatory framework. And in addition to incentive zoning and differentiated zoning, we are fortunate in many respects in Montreal to have what is probably the most assertive, or even if you want to call it aggressive, policy, which actually is expressed in law in the municipality of Montreal, which does not cover the entire territory, which is called the Bylaw for a Diverse Metropolis. And it actually requires that a certain proportion of all units built on a given project fall under agreed upon definitions of what constitutes an affordable dwelling indexed to median incomes across the metropolitan region, that it is deeply affordable, and that which is to say that there's a 30-year time horizon and mechanisms to ensure that, and that there are also social and family-oriented units within the mix. Now, the problem is that this bylaw was introduced, and with great fanfare, it was hoped to produce really exciting results. Of course, it was not as easy as it seemed at first, and so the bylaw was suspended and is now being reformed. So work that I'm doing with two colleagues, including Laila Ghaffari, who was mentioned earlier as one of the people who was involved on the early phases of the project with Vivre en Ville, and Richard Schirmer, we've been undertaking a detailed study of how did the bylaw for a diverse metropolis emerge, how is it reformed according to input from diverse stakeholders through public hearings, and most importantly, how can we advance on generative reform so that we can actually see the results that we need on the ground. And of course, as Ines noted, so many exciting things have happened in Montreal just in the 5-year horizon since this bylaw was introduced in its draft form for public hearings and public deliberation, that we're seeing a much more favorable framework for all sorts of exciting transformations. So the horizon is looking very exciting, and more importantly, what's happening right in front of us is very promising. There's plenty of work to be done, and I think that we're going to see some very exciting continuing developments even in the next couple of months as we continue to face the important challenges and seize the opportunities of affordable, but most importantly, nonprofit decommodified housing production and its stewardship and maintenance over a very long period of time. So I am hoping that our three-person presentation here has given you lots to think about and lots of inspiring ideas. I'm sure there are some questions that we'll be glad to take, but we've been very satisfied with the partnership and the elaboration of a set of responses and recommendations on how can we work through the barriers that exist vis-a-vis nonprofit housing in Montreal. And we do feel quite enthusiastically that there are some important lessons that can be carried forward to other parts of Canada. And of course, the BSH partnership is one of the most important vehicles for ensuring that that happens. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. What a wonderful presentation. We've got some time now for Q&A, so I encourage all of our participants to use the Q&A function to ask your questions. Let me start with this question here that we received. How similar or different are the barriers to nonprofit housing providers in Montreal? Sorry, this is worded a bit strangely. How similar or different are the barriers nonprofit housing providers in Montreal face compared to housing providers in other cities and provinces? And any of our panelists, feel free to answer.
I will take this. There's not a lot of difference. If there's one particular challenge for the city of Montreal proper, is that it's the most burdensome in terms of requirements and regulations out of a lot of the cities in Quebec. In most cities in Quebec, the main problem is going to be density maximums. If you want to build nonprofit housing, community housing, social housing, usually you need to scale the size of the building so that the subsidy that you get is actually allows the project to pencil in. And for a lot of smaller municipalities, the scale of that project does not make sense with the zoning in place. That might not be true in Montreal, but in Montreal, you're going to face other hurdles because it has a culture of really improving projects step by step and really putting a lot of input for every bit of development on its territory. So in that way, we could say that Montreal feels a bit like some of the really burdensome zoning or zone territories across Canada. Now, one of the differences in Quebec relative to other provinces is that there was a sector that was propped up by provincial investment over the 2 past decades, so that there's a lot of professionals who know how to handle development. The barriers that we've outlined in the presentation, especially in Ines's part, tend to be recent or recently gelled barriers that have come into place with the increase in construction costs, with more NIMBY activism across Quebec, and with insufficiently indexed funding stream to cover for the increase in opposition and regulations in the Montreal general area.
Thank you so much, Adam. We've got another question here about building on public land. It asks, building on public land is one solution to increasing non-market housing. From your perspective, how might recently announced municipal, provincial, and federal land programs impact nonprofit housing providers in Montreal?
I can start by just saying I think that it's very important. It's something that we've obviously been hoping for and lobbying for decades. The two questions that arise as entailments to the good news, in a sense, are how stable will the access to public land be? Not in the sense necessarily of the parcels that are given are made available for specific projects, but how predictable is it that nonprofit housing providers can factor that in? Because certainly one of the things that I've heard regularly, and I think we found, Adam and Ines, you can jump in here, of course, in the conversations in this specific project, where that the sort of the instability or the changeability of policies and regulatory frameworks is one of the things that both causes a lot of frustration, but quite literally increases costs for nonprofit housing providers. As Ines noted, there's important questions around institutional memory, especially when many organizations have fairly high turnover over, let's say, a 5-year period of time. And moving frames of reference, as I'm sure everyone remembers from secondary school physics, make everything that much more complicated to sort out, especially in terms of risk-related coalition or project configurations where there might be some patient capital involved. There would certainly be some dependence or some assumption around the availability of certain provincial or even federal funds, as well as local municipal mechanisms that help to reduce costs. And again, as anyone who's worked through a pro forma sheet knows, every month of delay translates into many thousands of dollars of direct costs that must be borne at first by the nonprofit housing provider, but then in the long run, of course, get passed along to the households who are going to occupy those dwellings.
I'm going to tack on to that it's very true and evident that public land should serve public housing. A lot of the public land that could be made available is not particularly suited at the current time for building projects. There are issues of contamination and also location. Not every public plot of land is someplace where we would want to build housing because it's not particularly well suited for residential uses. Oftentimes, even when it is, it's not serviced. And the infrastructure costs for water and sewer tend to be borne out by municipalities. So without an adequate funding stream, when we give out those public lots to builders to make sure that the plots are serviced, that they're decontaminated, which is a challenging word for me, as you can tell. There's a real risk that the land just sits vacant. And at that point, it's a real missed opportunity. And we should take care to think through what are the real winning conditions and where we actually want to see development.
I might add quickly one important thing that is in the cases, as Adam notes, where land is not necessarily that undesirable or doesn't have as many sorts of cost entailments. We know from experience in contexts such as Germany, where similar sorts of undertakings have been made, where public land was made available. There's a really important sort of visibility or demonstration quality to projects that do get constructed, and there can be questions that arise among, or certainly in the minds of cynics, about who benefits from nonprofit housing being built on public land, because especially if the number of units that get generated is quite small, then this is another argument in favor of the need for scaling up and to look at our enormous banks of public right-of-way and other land that is in public ownership in strategic areas. So in short, what I think one of the concerns is that we have to be extra careful when we are taking advantage of public land that's available to ensure that the work that gets done on building nonprofit housing is super exciting and super compelling and has a really strong positive demonstration effect at a much for different sorts of audiences or observers.
I'll also just add that our Balanced Life Housing Sister Project Housing Assessment Resource Tools has the land assessment tool, which provides well-resourced land as well. So that's a really, like anyone can access that. Only certain communities are mapped, but it provides some really good metrics for thinking about what well-resourced land might look like across Canada.
I'll also add that on the matter of the lack of mastery of these transfers of public lands to real estate nonprofit developers, many cities in Quebec have developed guides for developers on how to navigate the lengthy and complex processes for approval. And it may be beneficial to think about how we can create such a guide specifically made for nonprofit developers and how they would have to deal with their particular framework and their particular tunnel towards a transfer of land. So this might be an interesting idea to explore in the future.
Thank you so much, everybody. We've got a few more questions here. One person has asked about the funding models used in these projects. Are most of them funded through the municipal, provincial, federal government, or are there other sources like community bonds or other sources of equity?
I could speak to the general situation, and maybe Nik, you have particulars of Village Urbain, Village Vert, if you want to share them. Right now, it's part of the barriers, and we could deal with this for hours and hours. There are no self-sufficient funding streams for the kind of projects that are currently being built. So that means that almost every housing provider and builder that means to create subsidized housing needs to stack programs which all come with their own sets of rules, regulations, and requirements. And it's always a Frankenstein creature. And it severely slows down the pace of construction. And none of the very exciting solutions that are currently being discussed, such as the new federal program for co-ops or community bonds, can actually promise to become self-sufficient, which is one of the reasons why we managed to deliver so many units in Quebec in the 90s. The provincial funding stream that we had covered all costs, from pre-development to land acquisition to building to operation. And it is tremendously helpful to have funding streams that cover all possible line items. So I would say that wherever we look, wherever we think about what would be needed for adequate funding, we need to make sure that what we end up on is self-sufficient and does not rely on stacking sources of funding so that we see the results that we want.
I'll just add very briefly. I'm not at liberty to go into the details on the specific financing on the examples I mentioned of the Village Urbain, Le Cygne, and Village Vert. But there are many in-kind contributions that are coming, obviously, from the public sector sources, the state sources that were mentioned in the question by Isabelle. And the other thing is that we do have, obviously, a number of sort of, shall we say, nonprofit, private, philanthropic, or patient capital kinds of investment streams. With that said, as Adam mentioned, the stacking of different sorts of revenue streams is really important, and they are vital in terms of leveraging or ensuring that the non-state sources of revenue are involved, are willing to participate, so to speak, in the production of the nonprofit housing. And again, that's where the stability and the predictability of these funding streams is so very important, because when there has to be a scramble at the 11th hour, there are unhappy endings in some instances. It bears mentioning that Village Urbain as an organization is driven largely by people who are in the financial sector and who are interested in nonprofit, decommodified B Corp sorts of equity and investment pathways. So there's an enormous set of questions and opportunities that we should be tapping into in terms of how certain kinds of revenue or funding sources are available that are non-state sources, but what, of course, are the entailments, terms, and conditions of their participation. Because again, if we're going to scale up, we have to demonstrate success on what we're doing in the sort of demonstration or trailblazing projects.
Yeah, I'll just add in here too as well. Like one of our projects, Kensington Community Land Trust in Toronto, is actually using community bonds as part of their funding model. But it's a small part. It's like Adam and Nik have really drawn attention to. Many of these projects are dealing with needing to stack different fundings to actually provide any level of affordability, even the level of affordability, for example, that co-op housing is able to provide with the new funding is actually like it's not affordable for many households that need deeply affordable housing. So I just add on that, like there are those deeply affordable units that are needed. Often we're not getting at those levels with the current funding programs that are provided. I think the third point I'd want to just highlight is that often when developers, including private developers, not just nonprofit developers, come to the table with a solution, they might have that solution for one project, but we've often heard that they're not able to replicate that solution. So that's a problem, right? Because you have people that are, stacking things in interesting ways and really like coming up with a solution. And then they think, okay, we've done all this work. Let's replicate that same piece. And then the funder says, no, we're not going to do that again, right? So I think that's another issue, is that we're constantly having to we're constantly hearing that nonprofits are having to reinvent the wheel to make the funding work. And it's, if there is a funding solution that works for one project, there should be some assurances that it's going to work for another project. And right now we're hearing that's not the case. Adam and Nik, chime in if you've heard something different, but that's what we've been hearing consistently.
Quite familiar.
Thank you for that, everyone. Our next question asks, have the Montreal Metropolitan Community or City of Montreal articulated any targets for expanding nonprofit housing in the medium to long term? And I'll just add on to that. If so, can you elaborate?
I can take this one. So in Montreal City, but also in the greater Montreal, we're usually talking about and aiming towards a 20% affordable housing target. However, we do believe through our work at Vivre, through this research, but other projects, that affordable housing, as mentioned by Adam, is not necessarily the most coherent way of framing housing. We would rather speak first and foremost of nonprofit housing, and even more so, we think the actual advantages of nonprofit housing are only unlocked when we're looking at 50% of the market that is being held by nonprofit projects.
Yeah, and I'll add just briefly that there's a draft metropolitan plan that's going through public hearings right now, and it articulates exactly what Ines has just said, which is that the aim is to have 20% of the rental housing stock affordable on the 20-year horizon, and so it's not necessarily an articulated target of expansion of the number or the share. And as Ines and Adam really stressed, affordable is not actually very much an operative concept when we need to talk about nonprofit housing, because affordable is such a slippery notion and very much in the eye of the beholder. So again, and then with the bylaw for a diverse metropolis, one of the great frustrations is that it has quite literally produced 0 units. So in bricks and mortar terms, it's generated quite a bit of money in terms of developer commitments and cash in lieu of affordable or social units. But again, the pudding is not yet setting in very good ways to be able to say the proof of this policy mechanism or these objectives, these aspirational objectives that we always see in planning, are going to get met. So we're trying to achieve what we have had historically as nice targets, but which we typically don't successfully meet.
I think I'll jump just right back in just to mention that I did say Vivre does advocate for like 50% nonprofit housing, but in terms of the real estate development sector, especially in nonprofit, we are hearing different targets by different organizations. Some will necessarily say 20% just to get the ground running and just try to get projects to be funded. It will be interesting to see how the ASHA, so the Alliance, tries to develop that idea, and if they can challenge the sector to go forward with a 50% target, but we've yet to see the actual benefits in that sense. So I'm excited to see what's next.
And I will cap this off by saying that to Nik's point, that we have those objectives, and sometimes they're written in law. The law says that we need to have 20% affordable housing units and new projects, and that delivers zero net new units, which I think is the exciting part about talking about nonprofit units rather than affordable units, because one of the key problems we see over and over and over again is that we have those targets, but we don't have the funding. Because the funding always tries to match the dollar invested in those projects with target rents, and there's simply never enough money to make the buildings work or the pro forma work. So if we want to see a counterweight to private interest in the overall market, we probably need more flexibility on the target rents at the moment of construction, and just a nonprofit tenure in operation, which will allow us to scale the actual units we deliver with the objectives that we set in law or on paper. And I think that is really key to our research. If we only have objectives, it's not going to work by itself. We really need to think about how these things are financed and get built.
Thank you, Adam. You actually just touched on the last question I believe we'll have time for today. This research project involved a partnership between academia and the community partner, Vivre. In your opinion, what additional research and data needs could academic institutions like this one support with?
I can speculate on that one, but I'm keenest to hear from Adam and Ines on what's on your wish list now that we're drawing this particular project to a close. If it's useful, one of the reasons that the folks at Village Urbain and Échelle Abordable approached me is that they, and this is a very nice example of an in-kind contribution of sorts from an academic institution. We're going to be helping them with a lot of the sort of crowdsourcing activity, which is quite labor intensive and requires specialized skill, method, knowledge, etc., for being able to talk to diverse publics, for being able to, of course, then take whatever we are able to gather in terms of input and convert it into a usable information that's being synthesized, that identifies strong themes, preoccupations, new questions that are arising, etc. And of course, we're delighted in universities, especially where we have programs in fields where the students, I can say, are just panting for opportunities to engage with work at the coalface of improving the situation in nonprofit housing and ensuring that cities and suburbs are accessible to all sorts of different people. So that kind of direct experience is something that is tremendously valuable, both for students and I think is something that universities can contribute quite readily to the nonprofit sector. So that's one line that I think is always promising and rewarding.
I think my addition would be very self-interested, but I would be curious to get a data set with all rents across Canada, with all of the included amenities. What do the units look like? And I mean, that's kind of like a rental registry. That would be nice to have. I think that would help a lot of all of the research that we could be doing, both in academia and with community partners like Vivre. But again, it's very self-interested.
And I will tack on to that one of the key areas of interest of our work generally on housing dynamics is the effects of rent control, because we know it's received knowledge that rent control is bad for housing markets. We don't think it's true. And we have a couple of really interesting demonstrations, a couple of which come from CMHC itself, but also the study that was done by the government of Quebec on its whole rent control policies in the 90s, which show that there is no impact on new construction. And we've managed to deliver more primary rental market units compared to other provinces which have looser rules around rent control. So we would want to get that data and those demonstrations up in the public and shore it up with additional calculations and demonstrations and narratives so that we can actually have a real conversation about what do we stand to gain by indexing rents for buildings that are already built to market prices continually. And I don't think what we get is better housing or more construction activity.
Thank you so much, everybody. I hope that research can take place soon. With that, I will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you so much once again to all of our panelists for being here today. If you'd like to revisit this research in progress webinar, you'll be able to find the recording on our website in the coming days, and we encourage you to reach out to us or our panelists if you have any further questions. To learn more about our research, including the research on today's topic, visit our website at bsh.ubc.ca and stay up to date with all things balanced supply of housing by signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media, links to which you can find in the chat. With that, thank you everyone for being here today, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.